Our next speaker is another one of ADI's top analysts, Brandon Johnson. He's going to talk about now a subject we haven't talked about too much, but we've mentioned here. That's natural gas liquid supply, pricing, and monetization options.
All right, so far today we've talked to you about natural gas monetization and also the natural gas value chain. I'll be talking to you all about NGLs and the NGL monetization options. And I'll be returning to good times. I want to leave you with 5 key messages. The first of which is talking about NGL supply. We expect NGL supply to grow moderately through 2020. This is giving a lower for longer oil price scenario that many in the industry have. Secondly, NGL demand is growing rapidly. This is due to capital investments coming into fruition through 2017 and 2018. And my third point is focused on ethane. Ethane demand is rising rapidly due to new crackers and new terminals coming online. This will cause prices to rise. It will cause ethane rejection to decline. And it will also disrupt or impact supply into the U.S. Gulf Coast. My fourth point is NGL terminals or LPG terminals on the East Coast will reduce pipeline transfers into the U.S. Gulf Coast. And my fifth point is there's a lot of factors impacting the NGL market, as NGLs are used in a wide range of industries across the world. This leads to a lot of uncertainty, which leads to a lot of risk, but also a lot of opportunities as well. First, I'll give a holistic view of NGL supply before I hone in on ethane and LPG. Well, first, I guess if you don't know, NGL is comprised of 4 light hydrocarbons, and that's ethane, propane, butane, and pentane. There's a wide range of end uses from residential and commercial heating to transportation fuels and petrochemical feedstock. And my presentation is more focused on NGL production and natural gas processing, not necessarily refining. Looking at NGL production in the U.S., you see that it's at an all-time high at about 3.5 million barrels per day in 2015, or 16, mind you. It has risen drastically and rapidly from 2010 levels, but it will grow moderately, still at a pretty fast pace of about 12% CAGR per year to 2020, but it'll rise to about 4 million barrels per day. And also over this time period, I know you can't see it on the screen on the right, but on the left you can see it, ethane rejection will decrease over this time. Now I've broken down NGL production by basin. You see that it's about 4 basins that comprise anywhere from 85 to 90% of NGL production. And that is the Eagle Ford, the Permian, the Anadarko, and the Marcellus Basin. Most of these basins are located near the U.S. Gulf Coast, as the Eagle Ford and Permian and the Anadarko is. Anadarko is in Oklahoma. But the Marcellus is the only major producer that's far away from the Gulf Coast, is located along the East Coast in Pennsylvania. Most of these basins will experience moderate growth through 2020, with the exceptions being the Permian and the Utica. The Permian Basin's production of NGLs is growing rapidly, and it will grow by over 40% in the year 2020, while the Utica, on the other hand, will have a slight decline in production, but this will be offset by production in the Marcellus nearby. Now, on this slide, I've broken down production by product. You see ethane, propane, butane, and natural gasoline, or better known as pentane. We expect ethane and propane production to rise to about 1.5 million barrels per day each. From 2010 levels, that means ethane production will almost grow 50%, while propane's production will grow 3 times the amount it was in 2010. Over the same period of time, we expect moderate growth from butane and natural gasoline. And this leads me to my second key message. Demand is rising rapidly, as we've seen a lot of ethane crackers that are poised to come online over the next 2 years, as well as the 2 new ethane terminals, the one Marcus Hook and Morgan's Point down here in Texas. There are 2 monetization options when it comes to NGLs. The primary option is exports, which is primarily driven by LPG, And the other option is conversion, which is driven by ethane and I guess LPG at the same time into ethylene and propylene. On this next slide, I have a map of the U.S., and it shows the NGL terminals across the U.S. We see that a bulk of the activity is based along the U.S. Gulf Coast. This is for two reasons. Its proximity to high demand regions such as South America and the Asia Pacific, but also because of the large salt caverns in Mount Belvieu that can store large amounts of NGLs. But as we can see as well, terminals have expanded to the West Coast and the East Coast. The Sunoco terminal is the Marcus Hook, and the Enterprise is the new ethane terminal at Morgan's Point. The graph on the left shows U.S. exports by product. And as you can see from 2010 to 2015, it was primarily driven by propane. But we expect this to flip as by 2020 or I guess 2017, ethane exports will be more than propane exports, and this is primarily driven by the new export terminals. Conversely, looking at U.S. exports by region, we see that over the past 5 to 6 years, this has been primarily driven by Latin America. But going forward, this will be primarily driven by Asia, and this will be aided from the Panama Canal's expansion, now that very large LPG carriers can transit through very efficiently, making transportation costs cheaper than it has been in the past. And now I'll focus in on ethane. There are a lot of ethane not a lot, but there's about 7 or 8 ethane crackers that are supposed to come online over the next 2 to 3 years. This will drive up ethane prices, reduce ethane rejection, and impact supplies into the U.S. Gulf Coast. Looking at the ethane crackers that are poised to come online over the next 3 years, we see that for the most part, they're located along the U.S. Gulf Coast. There's also one, the Sunoco plant, that has been located along the U.S. East Coast. And as well, there are additional crackers that are being considered, the one by Total and a joint venture by ExxonMobil and SABIC. So most of the demand for ethane is located along the U.S. Gulf Coast. Mind you, the bulk of production of ethane comes from the Marcellus near the Sunoco terminal. So Sunoco will be oversupplied, and all of the ethane, or a lot of ethane from the Marcellus and the Bakken in North Dakota has to be driven down to Texas to supply that emerging demand. Now I'll focus in on ethane crackers. Just last year, 3 came online, and apparently there are 7, that are supposed to come online in 2017 alone, and another 3 through 2019. I'm sure this sounded like a great idea back in 2 or 3 years ago, but right now supply will not meet this rapid growth in demand. And we'll see an additional 750 to about a million barrels per day demand come on along the U.S. Gulf Coast alone. And this is all driven by ethane crackers. This is a collective picture of the U.S. ethane demand since 2014. From this, you can see that demand will rise to about 1.8 million barrels per day by the year 2020. As you can see in 2014 and 15, the demand was primarily driven by just U.S. ethane crackers and U.S. demand, along with pipelines going into Canada. But in 2016, as crackers started coming online, as well as the 2 export terminals, this will cause an additional amount of demand to come through. Now comparing supply to demand, as you can see in the past, there was a surplus in ethane. But going forward, probably just a few months to the end of this year, demand will overtake supply. And this is even considering, let's say, only 5 of the crackers come online. And I know someone's probably thinking, what about ethane supply from refining? That's only about 100,000 barrels per day, so that really won't help the supply mix much. Since ethane demand is rising rapidly, but ethane production is experiencing moderate growth, prices will rise. And we expect ethane prices to rise about 3 times the value that is today to about over 50 cents per gallon in 2020. This will encourage flexible crackers to utilize more propane. Rising ethane prices will also drive ethane production and shipments into the U.S. Gulf Coast. But regardless of the price, the Gulf Coast will need the supplies of the Marcellus and Bakken, so they'll be more apt to pay this transportation cost regardless. Next, I'll talk about new terminals of LPG and how that affects pipeline transfers into the U.S. Gulf Coast. As you can see, most LPG terminals are located along the U.S. Gulf Coast, but this has expanded to the west and the east coast. Honing in on the east coast, specifically the Marcus Hook and the region surrounding it, we see LPG demand increasing drastically in 2017 and 2018, increasing by an additional 350,000 barrels per day. This increase in demand will be offset by a decline in demand or shift in demand from the U.S. Gulf Coast, which I've illustrated on the page here. In addition to this propane demand caused by export terminals, there's also additional demand coming online from PDH units. Actually, you can see in 2017, or maybe the beginning of 2018, there's an additional 100,000 barrels per day of demand caused by new PDH units, and there are still 2 more units under consideration from Sunoco and Ascend. This heightened demand will cause prices to rise, and we think propane prices will increase by about twice as much as it is today, to a little over 54 cents per gallon in 2020. Increased propane prices will cause butane and ethane prices to rise as well. And this brings me to my 5th key message, is that there are a lot of factors impacting the NGL market, as NGLs play a key role in a lot of markets across the world. For instance, NGL markets includes U.S. cracker feedstocks, U.S. fuel blending, cracker feedstock choices, and LPG fuel use in emerging markets. An example of this, of LPG fuel use in emerging markets, is the demand of ethane will be closely tied to some emerging markets. So for instance, in India, if the GDP growth in India is positive, you'll see heightened fuel demand for LPG. But if it declines or slows in any way, that directly impacts the NGL market. An example of this is that when Asian propane prices closed in and closing the gap to the prices at Mont Belvieu, we saw a drastic reduction in demand coming from Asia, which directly affected the shipments going into Asia over the course of this past fall. So I'll repeat my 5 key statements of today, or key messages. 1, U.S. production is increasing, but it's increasing at a moderate rate compared to what it has been over the past 5 to 6 years. Secondly, NGL demand is growing rapidly, and this will cause prices for propane and ethane to increase. And third, since ethane prices will increase, this will reduce the amount of ethane rejection. This will also impact supply to the U.S. Gulf Coast. So more than likely, there won't be enough supply going into the U.S. Gulf Coast. And fourth, LPG terminals on the East Coast and even the West Coast will reduce pipeline transfers and volumes of LPG entering the U.S. Gulf Coast. And lastly, there are a lot of factors impacting LPG markets, or NGL markets as a whole, but this creates a lot of risks as well as a lot of opportunities. So thank you.
Will the crackers suck up all ethane exports? Or will some of our U.S. crackers go idle?
I don't know, because if you think about it, if even half go idle, I mean, that demand is still there because so many are coming online, and at least expect us to come online through 2019.
And I don't remember how much the projected ethane exports are. It would seem hard to believe we could be exporting ethane and idling a U.S. cracker. If I were the cracker owner, I could probably pay more for it.
About 1 million barrels per day in 2020.
And how much idle capacity did you project?
Which means we'll keep about a third, because it'll be about 1.5 million barrels per day in 2020 production.
So I'd be interested in you guys, in your follow-up email, tell us what you think is going to happen in that battle.
Okay.
free work, we can get it.
Any evidence of greater substantial gathering systems for ethane? You showed the arrows coming from the other plays, other shales coming to the Gulf Coast. I think it was a slide or two after this.
This one.
Well, it was the arrows showing.
Oh, the pipeline transfers. Okay.
Any evidence of that on ethane additional gathering systems?
It's not existent. Like, so I'm not sure exactly what you're.
Well, that much growth in ethane has got to get piped to the Gulf Coast or to the East Coast. And so we got to have pretty good gathering systems to get that done.
So if I may just comment on that, right? I mean, I think there is plenty of ethane within North America. The issue is that the pricing is not attractive enough to incentivize its production or transportation. So again, back to your question, Stephen, I think if once the crackers come on stream and let's say there's a shortage of ethane on the Gulf Coast, there's plenty of ethane in the Rockies, there's plenty of ethane in the Bakken that will start flowing down to the Gulf Coast because the price of ethane will rise and that will be enough to cover the transportation differential from those places.
But where was the ethane going before? I mean, the Rockies
So
don't
right
have a big ethane.
now it is being rejected. They are selling it with methane as fuel.
Oh, it's left in the fuel gas.
Yeah, so right now about 500,000 barrels per day of ethane is being rejected into the fuel system.
That brings in, you said that the injection will come down. So what will that do to the fuel market? Because the fuel off-takers are there, they're looking for a certain guaranteed fuel gas. Now it's met by ethane reinjection. So you think the GP suppliers will be
So not really. So
adjusting the current value or something?
So actually,
it's an idea, it's a standard, right?
yeah. So
1000
actually,
BTU, whatever that means.
so actually, the end user does not like ethane being rejected into their stream because it exceeds the
That's for the
caloric. No, I mean any end user, right? Because they design their plants to a certain spec on the calorific value. So right now there are so if you go and talk to gas plants, they'll tell you that you want to reject more ethane, but they are limited by the burner.
Producer
Yeah.
putting it into the.
Right.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure, please.
Sorry. So at some point, there's got to be an equilibrium between naphtha and ethane. No?
In terms of pricing, or
Well, in terms of application.
Yeah, no, so I think we are at that equilibrium point right now because oil prices have fallen to so much that naphtha is become very cheap. So if you go and talk to the petrochemical crackers in Asia, they'll tell you that they are cracking a lot more naphtha. Even guys like Reliance and Borealis who are contracted to import ethane out of Morgan's Point, for example, right now. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that that there will be an equilibrium point, but you know, it also ties into naphtha markets. If you look at naphtha markets, there are two types of naphtha. There's light naphtha and heavy naphtha. Heavy naphtha is what makes an excellent cracker feedstock. Light naphtha is not such a good cracker feedstock. Heavy naphtha is actually a balanced market. Light naphtha is an oversupplied market. So at some point, right, the crackers that are using heavy naphtha are also going to run out of that heavy naphtha, and at that point they'll have to revert back to NGLs or LPG. So yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying is correct, but it's not as if there's plenty of naphtha that will displace a lot of ethane coming out of North America. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does, but I'm trying to get, I'm trying to understand it. If we're betting on ethane rising, then that equilibrium is going to be out of whack again.
Well, so this is fairly complex, right? I mean, because what we are saying is, right now ethane is oversupplied, and that oversupply is being exported. Once the crackers come on stream, that oversupply will go away and it will actually put some pressure on exports, at which point of time you're going to incentivize additional ethane production or reduction of ethane rejection that will start flowing down into the Gulf Coast. Now, there's a broader question is what is happening today, and I think what is happening today is there is competition between North American NGLs and naphtha, but that is that is being decided almost on a weekly basis by crackers, right? Depending on what kind of trading terms they can get for their inventories at this point of time. So right now, actually, is what we are seeing. We are seeing a lot of competition between NGLs and naphtha right now. But I think in the long term, we anticipate some of that to get resolved, and this ethane will find a home.
So these ethanes are on a long-term contract. I don't think they're all on short-term contracts.
Short-term contracts.
Anticipating these crackers coming online.
Right.
For example, the Enterprise, the one that is going,
Yeah.
I read somewhere it's all a short-term contract.
Yes, that's correct.
Anticipating.
Yeah, but so even if it is a short-term contract, doesn't mean that it will stop happening, because end users, petrochemical companies have to invest in the shipping infrastructure. So for example, Reliance has bought 6 plants, or one of the companies here. Yeah, so they just can't walk away from that investment. Yeah.
So is it possible to transport ethane by rail to the nearby cracker that's coming up in Moscow?
No, I think
Or pipeline?
I don't know the answer to that question, but there is. I would expect that will happen through pipeline. So those are pipeline tariffs that we have assumed there, that we have estimated there.
So all the arrows are pipeline?
Yes, pipeline
Right
differential.
from Bakken to...
Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Brandon.